Hi, John. I'm very excited to join you today to do one of our semi-regular features, which we call Move Smartly Ideas. This is where you and I get to sit down and discuss in a little bit more depth some of the housing research or economics or bigger ideas that we're seeing in Canada and around the world in a little bit more detail than we usually get to do.
Looking forward to it.
So in that spirit, because thousands of children are going back to school and their teachers going to ask them what they did over the summer holidays, I figured I'd ask you the same,
Mhm.
specifically because you spent a month in Greece where you shared with us some really interesting content about the housing market and the structure and nature of housing in Greece. And specifically, you put together a great little walking tour video on your Instagram telling us about the history of the dwellings that you see all over Athens, the polykatikias. Is that right?
Polykatikias. Yeah, that's good.
Not bad, polykatikias of Athens. I've Googled, I know enough Greek to know that poly means many, but I Googled the rest. It looks like katikia means a dwelling.
That's correct.
So
Yeah.
this is many dwellings, their word for
Mhm.
that kind of building. And it's about 6 to 7 stories, right, John?
Yeah, generally, exactly.
Okay. So why don't we look at this clip? And if you're listening, you are urged to look at the Insta for the visuals. They are fabulous.
One of the first things that stands out when someone walks the streets of Athens is all of these 5 to 6 story apartment buildings that line the entire city. The Greeks call them polykatikias, and they're basically small condominiums. And when I see them, I think, how did the city end up the way it did? How did the city end up making this the dominant form of housing? And the story is actually quite interesting. At the end of the Greek Civil War in the late 1940s, many of the Greeks in these poor rural communities fled those areas and rushed to urban centers like Athens. And this population boom put a lot of pressure on Athens, in particular during a time when they lost a lot of their housing stock during the Second World War. Now, the Greek government didn't really have the means to actually build housing. So the solution was actually driven by the people. And one of the cornerstones to this solution was something the Greeks called antiparochi, which has no direct translation, but the closest is basically a mutual exchange. And the way it worked was that the builder would approach a homeowner and a landowner and basically say, let me take over this property. I'm going to build a bunch of flats on it, and you're going to get 2 or 3 of them when the building's done. And the builder would basically sell the rest of the units to cover their costs and to make a profit. Now, again, the system really wasn't designed by the government. The government kind of got out of the way and let builders build, and they didn't really monetize this, but it was a solution driven by the people. And of course, one of the challenges at the time was that mortgage underwriting and financing was not what it is today. If builders had to buy the land to build, that of course was a challenge financially. So this effectively bartering system where landowners would swap land for units after the fact, no money was ever changed hands, took that barrier out of the way and allowed sort of the construction boom to happen. Now, the other big driver was that the Greek builders took a what was at the time relatively modern and innovative approach to construction housing called the domino method from the Swiss architect Le Corbusier, which basically was a bunch of concrete slab floor plates with a minimal number of thin columns on the perimeter. And this is quite important because basically it got rid of the need for any load-bearing walls or load-bearing beams, which gave the builder the maximum flexibility when designing units. But more importantly, it was a relatively easy and inexpensive way to actually build housing. So easy that many actual residents ended up actually becoming citizen builders. So this was kind of one of the key drivers that drove sort of the construction boom. Now, I will say that Greeks do have a love-hate relationship with some of these buildings. Many of them at the time were built poor quality. Today are in desperate need of repair because they haven't been maintained. Aesthetically, many of them are not the nicest looking buildings because they weren't designed by architects. They were designed by civil engineers, and they look like they were designed by civil engineers. But at the end of the day, it addressed the housing crisis at the time. Was one of the key drivers for Greece's booming GDP in the 1950s and 60s, and of course is one of the reasons why Greece is such a dense city. Now, Canada's approach after the Second World War was quite different. Canadian government got very active in building or encouraging the construction of 2 types of housing, apartment buildings for renters and detached homes for the middle class, and that was a very different approach. Now, when we think about how different governments approach sort of solutions to a given housing crisis, I think it's important to keep in mind that the solutions really are a function of the challenges and the constraints at that time, the vision of the people and the values of the people and the politicians. And more importantly, the decisions that are made have a very big impact on the role that housing plays in our society, in our economy, and our built environment years and decades into the future. So as we think about Canada's own housing crisis and we hear about the solutions that our governments are proposing, I think it's important to keep that in mind, to think about what are the solutions and what are the challenges that they're trying to address, and why, despite all the promises and all of the proposed solutions, the things in Canada appear to keep getting worse rather than better. And of course, the answer to this is challenging, but I think it's important to keep some of these ideas in mind when we're hearing and thinking about how our politicians plan to approach Canada's housing crisis.
Okay, really love that. You might have another
glad.
career in you as a travel show guy.
I tried to do a few more, but it takes a little bit of time and some thought. But yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed that one, and a few people enjoyed that. I have a lot of Greek friends who didn't even know the history of that, so it was fun to share that.
Not to mention just the beautiful, just you felt immersed in the cafes as you strolled by. Loved it. So let's start digging in a little bit more into some of the things you mentioned. One of the things I found really fascinating was about a key driver that sort of really drove this kind of housing development across Athens. And that was the innovation unleashed, we should say, by the Domino House, which was an open floor plan, modular structure designed by the Swiss architect Le Corbusier. And I understand that he set out those plans in about 1914, 1915. So we're talking about World War I era. And then later on, these plans were taken up, as they were disseminated through, architectural thinking circles. And as I heard you talk about it, I did a quick Google, because I realized I lived in a building very similar to that you were describing. And this is because when I was researching in New Delhi, there are thousands of these type of buildings, the exact same formation, concrete, one stairwell. And that is because Le Corbusier had a tremendous impact in India, especially the building of New Delhi. So I found that really, really fascinating. So again, can you tell us a little bit more about what was this open model plan that he shared with everyone, and why did it later unlock so much more building?
Well, I think the key thing, there's a couple of key things to it. Number one, it was a relatively simple design. Like if you look at these buildings when they go up, and I think I shared a couple clips of them in the Instagram video, they're so basic. They're basically like concrete floor plates for every floor, and then just these structural columns that hold it up. Aside from that, it's completely open. So there aren't really load-bearing walls, load-bearing beams. It's just this basic concrete structure, which I think kind of influenced them at the time for a couple of reasons. Number one, it was cheap, and it was relatively easy to do. And when you research the history at that time, many citizens became builders. It wasn't as sophisticated as home building is here in Canada. It's like the average person sometimes would just build their own home, and they get a concrete guy to pour the concrete. And like I said, the structures are very simple. When you see them, they just put up the frame, and then they actually just layer bricks in between the gaps, basically, as the wall. But you never really see the bricks because they parge over them. It's not like here where the brick is the exterior. The bricks are literally just used to fill the gap. So it was really inexpensive. It allowed a lot of people to be able to build, and it allowed for very open, big kind of floor plans and different layouts. And I think those are the key things that led to the adoption of this in it. And I think is one of the key drivers of the building boom in Athens in particular.
Yeah, we threw in some visuals there. I'm going to put a link to some of the articles just showing that structure in our show notes. Now, John, right now across Canada, and especially in Toronto cities, there is a push. I've attended some conferences and activist moments from architects and others who are urging a revisit of the Canadian National Building Code and other regional building codes to allow for some design changes. And one of the interesting ones is in these medium-sized walk-ups to maybe not need to have two stairwells given the differences today in
Mhm.
safety and what we need to think about. So ways to maybe make changes to the requirements to allow more of this, a different type of building to reduce costs while staying safe.
Mhm.
Is that fair to say that's a bit of a parallel to what Corbusier was doing when he released these plans?
Yeah, I'd say there are parallels. I think one of the pushes and drives in North American cities is to allow some of this higher density type housing. Like a lot of the buildings in Athens, like these polykatikias, especially the smaller ones, are generally single stairwell buildings, right? Which is kind of what a lot of advocates are pushing for here. One stairwell up to say 6 stories, sometimes different construction materials. Obviously, we're not building with concrete the way they build there, but wood frame construction, those types of things. And a lot of this, of course, is to keep costs low. The lower the costs, ideally, the more affordable housing is, and encourages more supply and just different types of housing in different locations. So I think certainly that's one of the key drivers of some of the changes that people are pushing for in North America.
But then is it quick to say, is it so easy to extend that and say, oh, we just need to build more about this here? It occurs to me that Greece after World War II was not like Canada, a place where our soldiers went there and came back. Greece was a site of battle in World War II, of occupation by Germany and other forces. And so this was a very poor population. I can't imagine their land value was very high. And so
No.
I'm not surprised many people are got into building their own places.
Yeah,
So aren't we
exactly.
talking about a very different um, starting ground? Like if you're trying to now buy land to do these walk-ups here, this is very different from what was happening in Greece after World War II.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny you say that because something I've been thinking a lot about. I mean, a lot of housing experts think that we could just borrow what they did in Europe 100 years ago and do it here today. And if we build the types of homes that they have there, well, we'll look as dense and beautiful as Paris and Amsterdam and London, but we'll be as cheap as Buffalo, New York. And I'm being a little facetious, but the argument is if we just build like them, we'll be more affordable. And I do think there's a problem and a tension when you're, and I think more density and all of those things are great. But again, borrowing ideas from other places and from back in time, like even a lot of academics here now will just do what we did in the 1940s in Toronto when we had a housing crisis after the World War to solve our crisis. Well, the world was very different back then. You cannot just do what they did 80 years ago. And similarly, you're right. In a lot of other countries, the challenges were very different. So yeah, I mean, more density is good. These types of homes are great, but they're not the single solution to the housing. Again, I think this is a very North American view. I mean, North Americans call it the missing middle, which is these lower, mid-rise, higher density type of housing. We call it missing middle in North America because it largely is missing, and it is not missing in most European cities, right? But many of the European cities that have this missing middle housing that North Americans think is the solution to our housing crisis are not particularly affordable. And that's the funny thing is, you walk in Athens, you talk to Athenians. Yeah, I mean, yeah, homes in Athens are cheaper than here, but they're making 1,200 euros a month in income. You know what I mean? And a lot of other European cities face the very similar challenges. So, I think when we think about affordability, I think the problems are bigger than the types of homes we build, which I think is the narrative among North American academics and housing experts, I'd say. And I think they're kind of missing the point.
Yeah, actually, you make a great point because while there are so many fascinating ideas, Europe is undergoing a housing crisis of its own, which is giving rise to a lot of civil conflict and the rise of some extreme elements in their political
Absolutely.
spectrum. So its unhappiness with housing is even evident in these areas. But on the other hand, can we learn, I guess, a little bit in a more if we can say restricted case. So like looking at this, your video, an astute viewer on your Instagram left a comment saying that these projects are reminiscent of co-op buildings that once were more prevalent in Toronto. You see a lot of them down in the St. Lawrence area. And then, these are now being really promoted again, right? In Toronto and Vancouver. And I'm going to read the comment, put it up here. I guess co-op condos are kind of the same idea, just there are very few in Canada because of mortgage financing. I hope with the permission of 6 stories building on any main street in the city of Toronto, we may see this idea built more in Toronto. But my opinion, the problems are how to finance the units upon selling them, the profit for the builder in comparison with the high-rise condominium, the competition with the high-rise condo, and not having a proper self-management for these low-rise condominiums. So is it fair to say that these Greek yes, help me, the many dwellings, are comparable to the co-op? Or again, are we making too simple a comparison?
Yeah, I mean, not entirely comparable. So, I mean, I think when someone says they're comparable to co-ops, and I think what this viewer is talking about is if you look in a lot of older neighborhoods in Toronto, the original condos that were built, okay, and we have to separate. Co-op is, think of it as like a legal way to kind of build housing. And there's 2 types of co-ops, okay? The co-ops I think this person is referring to are the original condominiums. When these were built back in the 50s or 60s, we did not have condominiums. We had co-ops, and it's just like a different legal structure. Technically, the co-op corporation owns the building. You, as a buyer, buy into the corporation, but you have exclusive use of your unit. You're not buying a unit. So it's a very different legal structure, requires a bigger down payment. So, and those buildings look like, I think what this viewer is talking about, a lot of these low rise 5-6 story buildings, but they're not necessarily the same. I mean, some of them have they're just different structures. Some of them can have multiple stairwells. They look like low to mid-rise buildings, but the legal structure is different. So in some ways, yes, they're similar, but they're not similar in the sense that the legal structure of them was quite different back then. The other type of co-op, which we're not going to get into, is sort of nonprofit housing, where basically unit owners do not own the units; they have the exclusive use. It's kind of they're collectively deciding the rent. They're not investing in the asset; they just have more affordable housing. So different type of structures. But yeah, in theory, the buildings look like that this person's talking to, like the buildings from the 1950s and 60s. And I don't know, and they're right. I don't know how we're going to get back to building those and how it's going to be affordable in some of these urban neighborhoods.
So on that point, let's talk more about the absolutely wild barter system that was, I guess, could happen in a place like Greece at that time, or in Athens, between landlords and builders that saw landlords giving land to builders in return for, when their finished dwelling went up, take a unit or 2.
Yeah.
How formal were these arrangements?
Completely informal. Like when you read about it, it was just like on a handshake, maybe a written doc, like just very informal. And again, I think part of this was just that, financial markets back then weren't what they are today, right? So it was very hard to get financing as a builder. And this was a way that just allowed people to just basically like exactly barter. I'll give you the land if you give me 3 condos, basically, right? And of course, the number of condos that the landowner or the homeowner, if it was this little detached home, would get would be a function of the lot size and how many units are built, because some of these are bigger, almost like little like apartment buildings, like 50-unit buildings. Like some of them are only 10 units, right? So it really just depends on the size of the lot and what's built on it.
I mean, the sheer scale of this can't be underestimated. I remember taking their metro from downtown Athens to the suburbs, and it is just a sea of these buildings.
Yeah, it's hard to even to describe it. Like there are no houses really in Athens, in central Athens. Like this idea of a detached home or a like almost doesn't exist, right? All you see on every street, on main streets and on side streets, are these condo buildings everywhere. Like that's basically the main type of housing. You might start to see like detached housing in the distant suburbs, but even many of their suburbs are these types of buildings. They're just a little bit bigger, more spread out. Whereas in Athens, they're just like right up next to each other. There's no setbacks, like there's nothing like that. They're like literally one next to the other.
So you make the point that it is sort of the complete absence of a financing mechanism that leads to this kind of structure in across, because it was the only way to kind of do it at a time where you couldn't access building financing or mortgages, I would assume as well. I'm wondering if that is similar in Greece today, in the sense that, is there a mortgage market like ours here? And I ask because I know of other countries around the world where people don't just go and apply for mortgages to own a home like we do here in Canada. And I'm wondering what the situation is in Greece now. Has that changed? And how has that changed the other types of structures they have?
That's a great question. When academics talk about, they talk about like different housing regimes, and this idea of housing regimes is how sort of the housing economy is set up, and it is tied to what their financing system is like, what their mortgage process is like, how much debt people can borrow, what their home ownership rate is. And many Southern Europeans and Balkan countries have what they call, I think it's like called a familial housing regime. And in those countries, and Greece being one of them, home ownership rates are actually quite high, right? And they're quite high not because it's so easy to get money and homes are cheap and everyone can afford a home and this magical utopia. It's actually kind of the opposite. It's actually hard to get a mortgage, right? And what happens, and people need a bigger down payment. I don't think you can even buy a home with 5% down the way you can here, right? And because housing's expensive, what happens a lot is, you might have a family that has like a small 2-story polikatiki as their own, for example, right? And when their kids become of age and they want to get married, well, they just build another story on top of it. And then the next kid gets married, they just build another story on top of that, right? Or maybe they have like a detached home in the suburbs. Well, they just keep adding levels on top of it. So you have this multi-generational housing in many of these areas because housing's so expensive, and it's just cheaper to build another story than it is to go and buy an apartment or to buy a detached home, which is, of course, is very hard. So the turnover rate of real estate, I think, is a lot slower. But again, they have this structure where you see a lot of families kind of living almost within close proximity within the same building in many cases for these reasons, basically.
Interesting. So everyone in that unit would consider themselves a homeowner. Now, how formal are those arrangements? I don't know if you know this offhand. Are people, writing up intense legal documents that, son one gets this, son, or did that arise a little bit more organically? That might be hard to answer.
Yeah, I mean, that I don't know. I suspect, yes, they do have, I don't know actually. If it's the parents who are building it, maybe they keep it in the parents' name, and then upon in their wills they basically assign them to the kids. It's hard to say, but again, some of it might depend on who's paying for it. Like if the parents can't afford it and the kid's paying for it, I would assume the child would want to make sure that they're on title, say, and have the ownership of that unit. So I suspect it would depend on the arrangements within families, probably.
Interesting. But it seems like culturally, when it comes to the census, people feel comfortable in saying, I'm a homeowner, hence the high rate, regardless of where they are in that structure.
Exactly.
Within the family. So now I think viewers know, or most of our viewers know, that you are of Greek descent. So you've seen actual life lived out in these dwellings in Greece. And I want to come back to that after many years, because there's a growing trend for this. We're seeing now across Toronto and again, Canada, by because zoning laws are now being unleashed to allow granny flats or different kind of structures, or even fourplexes on a dwelling. A lot of families, myself, my family included, are thinking, oh, do we pool together to build like a multi-generational family, also solve other issues like how do mom and dad get on? And the difference I would think here is we're not being driven by the fact that we can't get mortgages individually. because people can, but that the prices are too high to
Mhm.
get the kind of product we want. And I would think that's what's driving us here. So a little bit of a difference. Is that something you are seeing picked up in Toronto? Is that a picking up trend? And
Oh yeah, I'd say for sure. Like we're definitely seeing more people being interested in multi-generational housing. And I'd say, you know, there are a couple of I'd say there are a couple of things that we're seeing on the ground, and I'd say the biggest thing is a lot of times people who are building laneway homes, right? So in some cases you'll have, I mean, I see it even on my own street where I live. You'll have like a homeowner who's lived in their home for 20, 30 years. They're getting ready to retire. And they basically decide to build a laneway home, and they will move and spend their retirement years in the laneway home, and the kid will move into the house, right? So that's one way parents are helping their kids. On the flip side, sometimes the kids are thinking, I want to help my parents, so the kids will buy a home that has the ability to build a laneway home, so eventually their parents can move in there, so they're within close proximity, right? So a lot of times, sometimes it's driven by the parents, sometimes it's driven by the children, right? But we're definitely seeing more of that, as our parents are aging and as people are being mindful of, how they're going to spend their retirement years, basically.
so going back to your informal knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
your years of visiting Greece and seeing family arrangements living in this way,
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can tell us about some of the pros and cons just
Oh,
from your
God.
own assessment, and what I'm thinking about is here, I would think in North America, culturally, when you're living in your parents' basement, however well set up it is, there's this sense that you want to get out of there. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if in some of those countries, there's actually more of an okay, like a, not only, oh, that we all live together, but this is right. This is how we do it. And there's nothing wrong
Mm-hmm.
about it. And maybe there's even something good about it. I'm
Mm-hmm.
wondering if this is just sort of a superficial take or whether you really think these differences are there.
Okay, there's definitely differences culturally. Greeks tends to be in each other's lives a lot. You know what I mean? Like people, I feel, and when I like people, I think here who will do a multi-generational home. Their mom's not walking into the kitchen randomly unannounced. Any time of the day, which is something that probably would happen more frequently, in many Southern European countries because it's more natural. Like people just, and that's not even just family members. Like in a lot of areas, you can just walk into a friend's home unannounced, knock on the door, come for coffee. You don't need to arrange it 3 weeks in advance. They actually don't. They'll think you're weird, right? But yeah, that can present some challenges, of course. Obviously, like, in every, some challenges have some households have challenging dynamics. And if your relationship's strained with your loved one or your mother or your child, whatever, you're sharing this home and you're kind of stuck together, right? So yeah, it can kind of create potential tensions. But again, I think it's, but for many families, it works, right? So I think it obviously depends on the individual, the household, all of those things.
Yeah, and here I wonder if the multicultural nature of Toronto, of Vancouver, might mean that there are some people to whom this kind of model, might seem a little more natural,
Yeah.
not so strange to have mom and dad soar around,
Mm-hmm.
but living in their own contained space. And the idea is more, it's different than just living all in one house.
Yes.
This idea is everybody has their own space and is
Exactly.
able to have their own kitchens, which I understand even in the Greek example is the case. It is
Mm-hmm.
not like there's one kitchen.
No, no,
It's
no. Yeah,
all
everyone
these,
has
even
their own
these
apartment. Yeah.
yes, all these multi-generational families still have their own kitchens and their units. I even saw a really cute thing in an island once where the daughter-in-law was sending things up to her mother-in-law in a basket
Oh yeah, yeah,
from
yeah.
one story. Like, I'm
It's
out
true.
of oil, olive
I
oil.
know, it's true. It's cute. I
So,
mean, they would do. I have family members that do that,
yeah,
and they're very connected. It's like, the children are like I call them children, like the children of the
50-year-old
main owner.
children.
Yeah, 30, 40, 50s, whatever they are, and their mom lives on the main floor. Their mom a lot of times will make dinner for everyone, right? Like it's just culturally a little bit different.
Yeah. So, moving from that, let's talk a little bit more now about the other debate that you covered and shared with us on your Instagram and other socials when you were in Greece, which is the Airbnb debate. And I think this kind of gets back to your argument that even though you have a lot of supply in some European countries, it doesn't mean that this supply can't be used in ways that give rise to current, I would say, angry debates. What were you seeing in Athens when it came to this like short-term rental debate?
Yeah, I mean, you'd see the graffiti, you'd see a lot of graffiti everywhere, like against Airbnbs and, you know, people converting homes into short-term rentals. Greece has a system basically like a lot of many European countries have these golden visa systems where, if you just buy a house in Greece, you get a visa to live and work in Greece, which allows you to live and work in obviously most of the EU countries. And, I think for many of those people, they don't even have to live there. Like many of them will just leave them empty or convert them to Airbnbs to obviously earn some revenue off of them. And again, in a country where housing affordability is very strained, like again, households don't make a lot of money. If you're making 1,200 euro a month, like what can you afford for rent? 400 euros tops? Like, you know what I mean? It's very difficult to find housing. And yeah, I think Airbnb is definitely one of the issues. And one of the things that's kind of top of mind to a lot of Greeks who are pressured. And again, I think, going back to I did another video on Airbnb, is very different. Like Airbnbs, someone who has a home and they're renting it short term while they're away for 2 months, very different. Many of the homes on the islands, I also think many people are less concerned about because those are like the cottages. Like most of the island, like I don't think most, many of the islands in Greece are ghost towns in the winter. Like people don't really live there, right? So those islands, they're less worried about it in the same way that North Americans are less worried about people Airbnb being a cottage, right? But on, one of the islands I went to that is inhabited all year round is kind of one of the main islands in the Kyklades region. They're actually, because I was speaking with realtors there, I was just curious to understand the market. And yeah, he was talking about how they're looking at the islands looking at banning or putting restrictions on Airbnb because it's impacting locals who are working there, people who are going to school there. So yeah, I think it depends on the region, but definitely they're looking at putting in policies in some areas that kind of restrict that.
So not too dissimilar from here. When he was writing for us before he retired, our correspondent Trent Hall from Prince Edward County, sort of like the holiday bedroom for Montrealers and Torontonians. Exactly. They had a lot of debates about Airbnb. It works really great for the tourists, but not so much for the year-long residents. So something like the same thing. And we've seen actually across Europe some really wild scenes of anti-tourism sentiment rising.
Yeah.
And no doubt, I would think that housing is one of the key drivers of that.
Yes, for sure.
Of that sentiment. So not that I want to become one of these not nice people who comes in and gets a place and Airbnbs it. But looking at how beautiful it was behind you and knowing what the prices are in Greece, I was tempted to get you to send me some listings. Now I'm wondering.
It's not expensive.
I know, that's why. But I'm wondering if many Canadians and others are kind of thinking it's easy to buy and get into the Greek market and maybe thinking there's more to it.
Yeah, so and it was kind of funny. I think everyone needs to be cautious when they're considering buying real estate outside of their main country because things work quite differently, right? And the one thing that stood out I found was how things work with these polykatikias, with these condominiums, right? So they're all generally owned, right? Like they're usually not rentals. Most of them are owned. But what happens is they are supposed to work the way condominiums work here, but kind of don't exactly work like that. And one example that would come up frequently is if there's 10 people in the building, the heating, of course, is shared the way it is in buildings here. There's a central heating system. Well, if the time comes each year to pay for gas to kind of prepare the furnace to heat the building for the winter, well, if 3 or 4 of the unit owners don't have enough money for the fuel to heat the building, Well, the other 6 or 7 have to either cover their share or there's no heat. Like those are generally the two options. And I have a family member of mine who said his building hasn't had heat since 2012 during the financial crisis, the Greek crisis, I should say. And again, I think that's one of the challenges. Now, and I asked, like, and when I brought this up with one of the real estate brokers, I'm like, how's that even possible? Like, aren't they obligated to pay? And he's like, yeah, technically, but their whole mindset is, well, what are you going to do? Sue me? It's 120 euros. Okay, go to court, and it'll take 4 years to sort it out, right? And and I guess because of that, no one goes to court. They just whatever turn a blind eye and let it go. So, I think in North America, you can't really do that. You can't not pay your condo fees, because if you don't pay your condo fees after a certain point, the condo corporation can force the sale of your unit, have you kind of kicked out, pay the fees, and move on, right? But the system's a little bit different there. So, and it's hard to say, is it because the legal structure doesn't allow for it? Is it because part of the, some of the unit owners feel bad for the people who can't afford it? Because they generally can. Many of them are like seniors who don't make money. So it's not like they're just, cheap, stingy people. Some of them just don't have the money. So, and I think that's one of the challenges, again, when you're buying in some of these areas. Some of those buildings are very poorly maintained for that exact reason. Some, of course, are very well maintained and are top notch. Some are not. So I think that's the caution when you're buying in other countries. You have to sort of understand the system and how things are working, right? I would have a massively hard time buying a unit in an apartment building knowing that half of the unit owners can decide not to, pay for something. And then either I have to cover their share or things kind of deteriorate. I mean, I'd have a huge problem with that.
And the heating issue aside, I mean, I guess in a country with Greece's climate, somehow, like, especially after the crisis, people are making do without the heat. But like the building I imagine some of these are in terrible states of disrepair. Like, are there actual, really rundown buildings across Athens because of this?
Some of them are. And you're right. The heat, it sounds crazy, obviously, living in Canada. Obviously, Greece doesn't get quite as cold, so they can survive. But yeah, some of them are in a poor state of repair. And you can kind of see it when you're walking outside. Like some just are not maintained, right? And again, I suspect part of this is who lives there, what is their income, and can they afford to maintain it? And what percentage of the unit owners can afford to maintain it. So I think that is, again, yeah, definitely one of the problems, that some are in a very poor state of repair.
And a final question. We just heard about a building in Kensington Market here in Toronto. It was a commercial building with 2 residential units at the top where the front just fell off.
Oh, wow.
Became detached. Do you see that kind of issue in Greece, given that, like, or in Athens, where, like, what if these buildings are so derelict, or is it not quite at that level? Somehow there's always enough inhabitants and enough investment.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say I've seen or heard much of those types of concerns where they're structurally unsound. You know what I mean?
Maybe it's that concrete.
Well, I don't know.
The concrete can't snap off.
Exactly. I mean, when I was actually looking, it was like I looked at a few places. I'm curious. I spoke with one broker about like detached homes on one of the island, and I'm like, don't you guys do home inspections? He's like, what are you going to inspect? Right? Like, and that was his mindset. Look at the roof. Look at this. What are you worried about? Right? Like, he's like, I guess you can bring an engineer, but their whole, I think homes require a little less maintenance. Again, partly because there's probably, snow, salt, all of those things impact homes. The winter, they don't have like roof and shingles necessarily, those buildings. So, they don't really need as much, but they need some, you know what I mean? But it was kind of funny to hear some of the brokers' kind of thoughts on buying housing in the process.
Yeah, it's I can't see you seem fully comfortable with that. Doesn't sound like the John Pasalis real estate advice.
No chance.
That you'd hear here. But
I was looking out of curiosity, but yeah, I don't. It's kind of a wild market. I think I'd even have a hard time buying a detached home there.
All right. Well, thanks. I actually really, really enjoyed digging into this. I encourage you to continue to explore a secondary career as a travel
Maybe
uh,
my next
a
travel
travel TV
housing
guy, a
commentator.
housing commentator. So definitely would look forward to more of those wherever you go,
Beautiful.
and maybe more from Toronto. We should be featuring on Move Smartly. I
There you
think you've
go.
got a knack for it.
Maybe
So
some more.
thank you again to John, and of course all of you for watching and listening to us on the various platforms you are watching this show from. You can get details on how to contact us in the show notes for today, and we'll see you next week with a new Move Smartly episode, and in a
No,
little
next
bit
week
with
we're
the,
taking a break, I think, aren't we? Next week we're
oh,
taking a break.
thank
We'll
you,
be back
John.
after Labor Day.
Yes,
Yes.
yes, yes. We're going to take 1 week break, and we'll see you after Labor Day. Thanks.